A letter trembles in weathered hands. The parchment bears stains of tears, sweat, and the dust of countless miles. In a dim cell beneath Rome's streets, an old man's voice breaks the silence. Timothy, my beloved son. The words echo off stone walls that have witnessed too many final goodbyes. But who was this Timothy? History remembers Paul the Apostle, the great missionary who carried the gospel across empires, the brilliant theologian who penned letters that still shape millions of hearts. Yet in those very letters, one name appears again and again, not as a footnote, not as a mere assistant, but as something far more profound. My true son in the faith. Imagine a young man caught between two worlds. A mother's Jewish prayers whispered in Hebrew, a father's Greek philosophy debated in marble halls, a soul searching for something neither culture could fully provide. Then one day, everything changed. A stranger arrived in his small city bearing scars and stories that would alter the course of human history. This is not the story you think you know, for beneath the familiar narratives of early Christianity lies a forgotten tale, the story of a timid boy who became a giant of faith, a reluctant leader who shepherded churches across the ancient world, a son who inherited not just Paul's mission but his very heart. Tonight we journey back to dusty roads and dangerous crossings, to moments when destiny knocked on ordinary doors, to discover how a young man named Timothy became the bridge between the old world and the new. The shadows are long, the hour is late, but some stories demand to be told. The Mediterranean sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone streets of Lystra as another day began in the Roman province of Galatia. The year was approximately 30 AD, and in a modest home near the city's edge, a young woman named Eunice cradled her newborn son against her chest. The baby's eyes, still unfocused and searching, seemed to reflect something deeper than the morning light filtering through the window. She whispered a name. Timothy. In Greek it meant honoring God or honored by God. But which God? That question would haunt this child's early years in ways his mother could never imagine. Lystra was a city of contradictions, much like the child born within its walls that morning. Roman soldiers marched down streets where Greek philosophers debated in shadowed alcoves. Jewish merchants traded goods with pagan temple priests. Mystery religions from the East mingled with ancient local traditions, creating a spiritual marketplace where every soul was for sale to the highest bidder. For Eunice, these contradictions cut particularly deep. She was a Jewish woman who had married outside her faith, a decision that would have raised eyebrows in Jerusalem and whispers in Lystra's small Jewish community. Her husband was Greek, a man of learning and culture, but also a man who worshipped gods her ancestors had fled Egypt to escape. In their home, two worlds collided daily. Eunice would light the Sabbath candles while her husband poured libations to household gods. She would recite the Shema while he quoted Homer. She would tell their son stories of Abraham and Moses while he filled the boy's mind with tales of Odysseus and Achilles. Timothy grew up bilingual not just in language but in soul. The absence of a synagogue in Lystra meant Eunice's faith existed in isolation. The nearest Jewish community was in Iconium, 21 treacherous miles through mountain passes that few traveled alone. Without a community to strengthen her resolve, without rabbis to guide her son's religious education, Eunice found herself the sole guardian of ancient promises in a household that barely acknowledged them. Yet she was not entirely alone. Living with them was Lois, Timothy's grandmother, a woman whose faith burned with the quiet intensity of banked coals. Whether she was Eunice's mother or mother-in-law, the scriptures do not clarify. But her influence on young Timothy was unmistakable. While his father remained distant from religious matters, perhaps already ill or simply disengaged, Lois became the boy's spiritual compass. In the evenings, after the marketplace crowds had dispersed and the temple horns had finished their daily calls, Lois would gather Timothy close. Her voice, weathered by years but strong with conviction, would carry him into ancient worlds. She spoke of a garden where the first man walked with God, of a flood that cleansed the earth, of a promise made to a childless old man who became the father of nations. Timothy absorbed these stories like parched ground drinks rain. But questions multiplied faster than answers. If the God of Abraham was so powerful, why did his people seem so scattered? If Moses had led them from slavery, why did they still wait for deliverance? And why, when his playmates spoke casually of Zeus and Apollo, did Timothy feel a strange stirring in his chest whenever Lois mentioned the name of the Lord? The boy's mixed heritage became both blessing and burden. His Jewish blood connected him to ancient covenants, but his uncircumcised state marked him as incomplete in Jewish eyes. His Greek father's influence opened doors to classical education and cultural acceptance, but left him spiritually rootless in Gentile society. He belonged fully to neither world, a situation that would prove providential in ways no one could foresee. Lystra itself reflected this cultural tension. Built on a major trade route connecting the Mediterranean coast to the inland regions of Anatolia, the city pulsed with commercial energy. Caravans arrived weekly, bringing not just goods, but ideas, languages, and faiths from across the known world. Timothy grew up hearing Arabic, Aramaic, Latin, and half a dozen local dialects in the marketplace. His ears became attuned to the music of human diversity. The religious landscape was equally complex. The city's patron deity was Zeus, whose temple dominated the central square, but smaller shrines dotted every neighborhood, honoring gods both familiar and exotic. Roman soldiers worshipped Mithras in underground chambers. Eastern merchants burned incense to deities whose names Timothy couldn't pronounce. Local farmers still left offerings at sacred groves that predated Greek colonization by centuries. In this spiritual bazaar, young Timothy learned to navigate carefully. His grandmother's stories had planted seeds of monotheistic conviction, but expressing such beliefs openly could invite ridicule or worse. The boy learned early to keep his deepest thoughts private, a habit that would later be mistaken for timidity but was actually the wisdom of survival. School presented another challenge. Greek education emphasized rhetoric, philosophy, and the cultivation of personal excellence. Students memorized Homer and Hesiod, debated ethical dilemmas, and competed in intellectual contests that prized quick wit over quiet reflection. Timothy excelled academically but struggled with the competitive atmosphere. While his classmates boasted and postured, he preferred listening to speaking, observing to performing. His teachers noticed his unusual maturity. Unlike other boys his age, Timothy asked questions that revealed deep moral sensitivity. When they studied the Iliad, he wondered about the cost of Achilles' rage. When they examined Plato's Republic, he questioned whether human justice could ever match divine righteousness. His essays, written in careful Greek script, displayed a wisdom that seemed borrowed from older souls. But wisdom came at a price. Timothy often felt isolated among his peers, too Jewish for complete acceptance among Greeks, too Greek for easy fellowship with the few Jewish families in neighboring towns. He learned to find solace in solitude, walking the hills outside Lystra where he could think without interruption and dream without judgment. These solitary wanderings became spiritual retreats, away from the noise of the marketplace and the competing claims of various faiths. Timothy felt something stirring in the silence. It wasn't a voice exactly, or even a clear sense of presence, more like an ache, a longing for something he couldn't name but somehow recognized as the deepest truth of his existence. Lois noticed the change in her grandson as he entered adolescence. His questions became more pointed, his silences more profound. He would return from his walks with a distant look in his eyes as if he had glimpsed something beyond the visible horizon. She began to pray more fervently, sensing that God was preparing this young man for something significant, though she couldn't imagine what. The year Timothy turned 16, strange rumors began circulating through Lystra's marketplace. Travelers spoke of a Jewish teacher who claimed to be the Messiah. Some said he had been crucified in Jerusalem. Others whispered that he had risen from the dead. The stories seemed too fantastic to believe, yet they persisted, growing more detailed with each telling. Eunice heard these rumors with a mixture of hope and skepticism. Could the promises Lois had taught Timothy finally be coming true? Or were these just more religious fantasies in a world already oversupplied with false hopes? Timothy listened to the debates with growing fascination. Something about these stories resonated with the unnamed longing in his heart. The idea of a God who became man, who suffered alongside his creation, who conquered death itself, seemed to bridge the gap between his grandmother's ancient faith and his own generation's desperate questions. But before he could explore these thoughts further, everything changed. Two men arrived in Lystra bearing fresh scars and an urgent message. Their names were Paul and Barnabas, and they carried news that would transform not just Timothy's life, but the entire trajectory of human history. The boy who had grown up between worlds was about to discover that God specializes in using the displaced, the questioned, and the seemingly forgotten to accomplish his greatest purposes. Timothy's time of preparation was ending. His season of destiny was about to begin. The morning air in Lystra carried the scent of baking bread and burning incense, a daily reminder of the competing hungers that drove human hearts. Timothy walked through the marketplace with measured steps, his eyes taking in familiar sights that somehow felt different now, as if he were seeing them through glass that was slowly clearing. At 18, he had grown tall and lean, his features reflecting the careful balance of his mixed heritage. His mother's Jewish blood showed in the thoughtful curve of his brow and the intensity of his dark eyes. His father's Greek lineage revealed itself in the classical line of his nose and the fluid way he moved through crowds. But it was something else entirely that set him apart from other young men his age. Timothy carried himself with the careful precision of someone who had learned early that words and actions carried consequences. In a city where religious tensions simmered beneath the surface of daily commerce, where Roman authority maintained order through the implicit threat of violence, where Greek philosophy and Jewish monotheism wrestled in the hearts of thinking people, he had developed the art of listening more than speaking. The other young men of Lystra gathered in the gymnasium to wrestle and debate, their voices rising in confident declarations about philosophy, politics, and the nature of the gods. Timothy attended these gatherings but rarely participated in the verbal contests that his peers seemed to relish. When pressed for opinions, he would offer thoughtful responses that revealed depth without committing to positions that might alienate half his audience. This diplomatic approach had earned him respect, but also a reputation for indecision that troubled his own spirit. Late at night, lying on his sleeping mat while his family slumbered around him, Timothy wrestled with questions that had no easy answers. Was his careful neutrality wisdom or cowardice? Was his reluctance to take strong public positions a sign of maturity or a failure of conviction? The sacred scrolls that Lois had taught him to revere spoke of bold prophets who confronted kings, of young men who stood alone against armies, of ordinary people who risked everything for truth. Yet here he was, an educated young man in a cosmopolitan city, and he could barely bring himself to express his deepest beliefs in casual conversation. His father's illness had worsened that winter, confining the older man to his bed for weeks at a time. Timothy watched his mother move between her husband's bedside and her daily duties with a grace that humbled him. Eunice never complained, never expressed bitterness about her difficult circumstances, never seemed to question why the God she served had allowed such hardship into their home. But Timothy questioned. Why did the righteous suffer while the wicked prospered? Why did his grandmother's prayers seem to echo in empty air while pagan festivals drew crowds of laughing celebrants? Why had the God of Abraham chosen a people who now lived scattered across the world, subject to foreign powers and struggling to maintain their ancient faith? These doubts felt like betrayal. Lois had invested so much love and patience in teaching him the stories of their faith. Eunice had sacrificed social standing and cultural acceptance to maintain their connection to the God of Israel. How could he honor their devotion while harboring such fundamental questions about everything they had taught him? The marketplace provided no answers, only more questions. Timothy watched merchants haggle over prices while swearing by different gods. He observed Roman officials conducting business with casual references to omens and auguries. He listened to traveling philosophers offer competing versions of truth to anyone willing to pay for wisdom. In this cacophony of competing voices, the stories Lois had whispered in his childhood began to sound increasingly remote. Abraham's call to leave everything familiar, Moses' encounter with the burning bush, David's impossible victory over Goliath. These tales belonged to a different world, a time when God spoke directly to ordinary people and performed miracles that entire nations could witness. Where were such miracles now? Where were the clear voices from heaven, the undeniable signs of divine presence? Timothy lived in an age of confusion where every religious tradition claimed exclusive access to truth, but none could demonstrate power that transcended human manipulation. His education had sharpened these doubts rather than resolving them. Greek philosophy taught him to question assumptions, to examine beliefs through the lens of reason, to demand evidence for extraordinary claims. The more he learned about logic and rhetoric, the more the simple faith of his childhood seemed naive and unsophisticated. Yet something deep within him resisted complete skepticism. When he walked the hills outside Lystra, when he sat beside streams that had flowed since before human memory, when he watched stars wheel overhead in their ancient patterns, Timothy felt a presence that no philosophical argument could explain away. It wasn't the anthropomorphic gods of Greek mythology, beings who seemed all too human in their petty jealousies and moral failures. It wasn't the distant, impersonal force that some philosophers described as the source of all existence. This presence felt both utterly transcendent and intimately personal, both infinitely powerful and tenderly concerned with individual hearts. Sometimes, in moments of unexpected stillness, Timothy thought he heard something like a voice. Not audible words, but a communication that bypassed his ears and spoke directly to his spirit. These experiences left him shaken and uncertain. Was he receiving genuine revelation, or was his longing for divine connection creating illusions that felt real? The question became more urgent as his father's condition deteriorated. The Greek physicians had exhausted their remedies. The local priests had performed their rituals. Even Eunice's prayers seemed to bounce off the walls of their small home without reaching heaven. Timothy watched death approach his family and wondered if any gods were listening. One evening, as he sat beside his father's bed, the older man opened his eyes and looked directly at his son. For a moment the fog of illness cleared, and Timothy saw the intelligence that had first attracted his mother years ago. "You're troubled," his father said, his voice barely above a whisper. Timothy nodded, not trusting himself to speak. "Good," his father continued. "Only troubled souls find truth. The satisfied never search." It was the most religious statement Timothy had ever heard from his father, and it would prove to be among his last words. 3 days later, the man who had given Timothy his Greek heritage and his questioning mind slipped quietly into whatever realm awaits the departed. The funeral rites revealed the complexity of their household. Greek customs demanded certain observances. Jewish traditions required others. Roman law imposed its own regulations on burial practices. Timothy found himself navigating between worlds even in grief, trying to honor his father's memory without betraying his mother's faith, standing beside the grave, watching earth cover the man who had shaped half his identity. Timothy felt something shift inside him. The careful balance he had maintained for 18 years suddenly seemed less important than finding solid ground to stand on. His father's final words echoed in his memory. "Only troubled souls find truth." Perhaps his questions weren't betrayal after all. Perhaps they were preparation. Perhaps the God his grandmother served was large enough to handle doubt, patient enough to work with confusion, powerful enough to transform uncertainty into something approaching faith. Timothy didn't know it yet, but his season of questioning was about to end. The God who had been silent was preparing to speak. The truth he had been seeking was walking dusty roads toward Lystra, carried in the hearts and voices of two men who would change everything he thought he knew about faith, courage, and the cost of following divine calls. The boy who had lived between worlds was about to discover that some boundaries exist only to be crossed. The dreams began 3 months before they arrived. Timothy would wake in the hours before dawn, his heart racing from visions he could barely remember but couldn't quite forget. Fragments lingered like morning mist clinging to hillsides, a voice calling his name, a road stretching toward horizons he had never seen, faces of people he had never met but somehow recognized. He told no one about these nocturnal visitations. In a household still mourning his father's death, in a city where dreams were either dismissed as indigestion or interpreted as messages from capricious gods, Timothy kept his nighttime experiences private. But they accumulated like stones in his chest, creating a weight that grew heavier with each passing week. Eunice noticed the change in her son. She observed him during their evening meals, watching as he pushed food around his plate while his thoughts wandered to places she couldn't follow. When she asked about his distraction, Timothy would smile and deflect, mentioning his studies or concerns about their reduced household income. But his mother's eyes had been trained by years of reading hearts, and she recognized the signs of a soul in transition. Lois, now the family's eldest and most perceptive member, said nothing directly but increased her prayers. Timothy would sometimes catch her watching him with an expression that mixed worry with anticipation, as if she sensed something approaching but couldn't identify what form it would take. The marketplace conversations had shifted that spring. Merchants arriving from the eastern trade routes brought stories that seemed too extraordinary for rational minds to accept, yet too persistent to dismiss entirely. They spoke of a Jewish teacher who had been executed in Jerusalem but somehow continued to appear to his followers. They described men who spoke in languages they had never learned, who healed diseases with a touch, who proclaimed a message that was transforming communities across the eastern Mediterranean. Most of Lystra's residents treated these accounts as entertainment, exotic tales to spice up the routine of daily commerce. But Timothy found himself lingering near the caravans, listening with an intensity that surprised him. Something about these stories resonated with the unnamed longing that had haunted his adolescence, the sense that reality contained dimensions his education had never explored. The local synagogue in Iconium, that distant community Timothy had visited only a handful of times, had apparently received visitors carrying this new message. Reports filtered back to Lystra describing heated debates, dramatic conversions, and equally dramatic rejections. The Jewish community was dividing over questions Timothy barely understood, arguments about prophecy fulfillment and messianic identity that required deeper scriptural knowledge than his grandmother had been able to provide. But it wasn't the theological complexities that captured Timothy's attention. It was the descriptions of transformed lives, of ordinary people discovering extraordinary purpose, of communities forming around shared conviction rather than shared ethnicity or geography. These accounts awakened something in him that years of philosophical study had never touched. He began taking longer walks in the hills surrounding Lystra, seeking solitude where he could think without interruption. The olive groves and rocky outcroppings that had provided refuge during his childhood became places of deeper contemplation now. Timothy would sit for hours watching shadows move across the landscape while wrestling with questions that seemed to multiply rather than resolve. During one of these solitary sessions, as late afternoon light painted the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple, Timothy experienced something that defied easy categorization. He wasn't asleep, so it wasn't a dream. He wasn't fevering, so it wasn't delirium. But for a moment that felt simultaneously eternal and instantaneous, the boundaries between seen and unseen seemed to dissolve. He found himself aware of a presence that had been there all along, hidden behind the veil of ordinary perception. Not visible in any conventional sense, but more real than the rocks beneath his feet or the sky above his head. This presence emanated love with an intensity that threatened to overwhelm him, but it was love tempered by holiness so pure that Timothy felt simultaneously drawn and terrified. In that moment of supernatural awareness, Timothy understood that his questions hadn't been signs of faithlessness, but preparation for revelation. His doubts hadn't separated him from the divine, but had cleared away false certainties that might have prevented him from recognizing truth when it appeared. The God his grandmother had described in whispered stories was not distant or absent, but had been waiting for the right moment to make himself known. The experience lasted only moments, but its effects rippled through Timothy's consciousness for days afterward. He moved through his daily routines with a new sense of expectancy, as if the ordinary world might tear open at any moment to reveal the extraordinary reality that lay beneath its surface. His mother noticed the change immediately. Timothy's distracted brooding had been replaced by a quiet alertness, an attentiveness to his surroundings that reminded Eunice of a shepherd watching for wolves or a sailor scanning the horizon for storms. When she asked about this transformation, Timothy struggled to find words that wouldn't sound like madness. "I think," he said carefully, choosing each word with precision, "that something important is about to happen." Eunice studied her son's face, recognizing an echo of her own experience decades earlier when she had first felt the stirring of faith in her heart. "What kind of something?" she asked. Timothy shook his head, frustrated by the limitations of language. "I don't know exactly, but I feel like we've been preparing for something our whole lives without knowing what it was, and now it's almost here." Lois, overhearing this conversation from her corner of their main room, looked up from the scroll she was reading and smiled. It was the expression of someone who had been waiting patiently for a long-delayed appointment, and finally heard footsteps approaching the door. The footsteps, when they came, belonged to travelers whose arrival would be remembered long after the dust before Paul and Barnabas' appear of their journey had settled. But on Lystra's streets, before the first words of their revolutionary message reached Timothy's ears, the young man experienced one final moment of preparation. It happened in the pre-dawn darkness 3 days before their arrival. Timothy woke not from dreams but into a clarity so sharp it made ordinary consciousness feel like sleep by comparison. He rose from his bed, moved silently past his sleeping family, and stepped into the courtyard where stars wheeled overhead in their ancient dance. Standing there in the cool air, surrounded by the familiar architecture of his childhood but feeling as if he were seeing it for the first time, Timothy spoke words that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his conscious mind. "I'm ready," he whispered to the darkness. "Whatever you're bringing, whoever you're sending, I'm ready to listen." The stars offered no audible reply. But Timothy felt something settle into place within him, like the final piece of a puzzle he hadn't known he was assembling. The questions that had tormented him for months didn't disappear, but they transformed from sources of anxiety into tools of discernment. The doubts that had seemed like barriers became bridges he could cross toward deeper understanding. He didn't know that his whispered declaration had been heard not just by the God he was learning to trust, but by two men traveling dusty roads toward Lystra. Men whose hearts burned with a message that would answer questions Timothy hadn't even learned to ask. The boy who had grown up between worlds was about to discover that God's greatest purposes often require people who don't fit neatly into any single category. His mixed heritage, his cultural confusion, his spiritual hunger, all the elements of his identity that had seemed like disadvantages were about to be revealed as perfect preparation for a calling he could never have imagined. The whispers were about to become a shout. The unknown was about to take human form and knock on his door. The dust cloud appeared first as a shimmer on the horizon, no larger than a man's hand but moving with purpose against the morning sky. Timothy noticed it from his position in the olive grove where he had gone to think, drawn by a restlessness he couldn't name. Something in the quality of that distant disturbance made him set aside his morning tasks and watch. Two figures emerged from the heat haze, walking with the measured pace of men who had covered many miles but carried themselves as if the journey had only just begun. Even at a distance, Timothy could see they moved differently than ordinary travelers. There was an urgency in their steps that spoke of more than personal business, a weight in their bearing that suggested they carried burdens heavier than the simple packs on their shoulders. The first man was compact and powerful, his frame suggesting strength earned through hardship rather than leisure. His companion was taller, with the bearing of someone accustomed to speaking before crowds. But it was something else entirely that made Timothy's breath catch in his throat. These men carried light around them like a visible atmosphere. Not the harsh glare of noon sun, but something softer and infinitely more penetrating. As they drew closer to Lystra's gates, Timothy found himself moving down from the hillside, drawn by a compulsion he didn't understand. Other townspeople had noticed the approaching strangers now. Merchants paused in their morning preparations. Children pointed and whispered. The ever-present Roman guards shifted slightly, hands moving closer to sword hilts with the unconscious vigilance of men who had learned that unexpected visitors often brought unexpected trouble. The shorter man, who Timothy would soon learn was called Paul, stopped just inside the city gates. He surveyed the gathering crowd with eyes that seemed to see beyond the surface of things. reading hearts like scrolls written in familiar script. When those eyes met Timothy's across the small plaza, the young man felt something electric pass between them, a recognition that transcended ordinary human encounter. Paul began to speak, and the marketplace fell silent in a way Timothy had never experienced. Even the most chaotic trading day created only pockets of quiet, temporary lulls between waves of commercial noise. But this silence felt different, as if the very air had become attentive, leaning in to catch words that carried weight beyond their sound. "Men of Lystra," Paul's voice carried clearly across the square, pitched not to overwhelm but to penetrate. "We bring you news of the God who made heaven and earth, the sea and everything in them." Timothy felt his grandmother's hand find his shoulder. Lois had appeared beside him without his notice, her weathered fingers trembling slightly as they gripped his tunic. In her touch he sensed decades of waiting crystallizing into this single moment. "In past generations," Paul continued, "this God allowed all nations to walk in their own ways. Yet he did not leave himself without witness, doing good by giving you rains from heaven and fruitful seasons, filling your hearts with food and gladness." The words were simple enough, but they carried harmonics that resonated in chambers of Timothy's heart he didn't know existed. This wasn't the philosophical discourse he had heard in Greek schools or the ritualistic recitations of temple priests. Paul spoke as someone who had encountered the living source of all philosophy, all ritual, all desperate human reaching toward transcendence. A murmur ran through the crowd as people began to grasp the implications of Paul's message. Some faces showed curiosity, others confusion, still others the beginning edges of hostility. But Timothy found himself leaning forward, hungry for every word as if his soul had been fasting without his knowledge. Then the miraculous happened. A man Timothy had known since childhood, a beggar who sat daily at the gates with legs twisted from birth, caught Paul's attention. Their eyes met across the crowd, and something passed between them that made the lame man's face transform. Hope blazed there like sunrise breaking over mountains. "Stand upright on your feet," Paul commanded, his voice carrying authority that seemed to reach beyond human will into the very structure of physical reality. The lame man leaped, not struggled to his feet, not slowly tested weak limbs, but leaped with the exuberance of a child discovering the joy of movement for the first time. He walked, then ran, then danced through the crowd while tears of wonder streamed down his face. Chaos erupted. Some people fell to their knees. Others began shouting in the local dialect, words Timothy barely recognized but whose meaning was unmistakable. The crowd was declaring Paul and Barnabas to be gods, Zeus and Hermes walking among mortals in human form. Timothy watched Paul's face transform from joy at the healing to horror at the crowd's reaction. The apostle tore his clothes, a gesture of distress Timothy recognized from Jewish mourning rituals, and raised his voice above the tumult. "Men, why are you doing these things? We also are men of like nature with you, and we bring you good news that you should turn from these vain things to a living God." But the crowd's religious fervor had been kindled, and Timothy watched with growing dread as the situation spiraled beyond anyone's control. The priest of Zeus arrived with oxen for sacrifice. Flowers appeared from nowhere. Incense began to burn. The entire city seemed to be transforming into a spontaneous festival. honoring the two strangers as divine visitors. Through it all, Timothy kept his eyes fixed on Paul. In the apostle's face he saw something he had never witnessed in any religious ceremony or philosophical debate. This man was terrified not of the crowd's potential violence, but of their worship. He was desperate to deflect glory away from himself toward something infinitely greater and more deserving. As the sun reached its zenith and the commotion began to exhaust itself, Paul's voice cut through the dying celebration with words that would echo in Timothy's memory for the rest of his life. The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man. He himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. And he has made from one blood every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him. Timothy felt tears on his cheeks without remembering when they had begun to fall. These words were answering questions he had carried since childhood. Questions about his mixed heritage, his place between worlds, his sense of divine searching that had never found its object. Paul was describing a God who had ordained diversity, who had scattered nations not as punishment but as invitation, who wanted to be found by seeking hearts regardless of their genealogy or geography. Yet he is actually not far from each one of us, Paul continued, his eyes seeming to find Timothy's again across the crowd. For in him we live and move and have our being. The words hit Timothy like physical blows, each phrase reorganizing his understanding of reality. This wasn't the distant deity of philosophical speculation or the capricious gods of mythology. This was the presence he had felt in solitary moments, the voice that had whispered in dreams, the love that had haunted his searching heart. As the crowd finally began to disperse, as normal commerce slowly resumed, as Lystra settled back into its familiar rhythms, Timothy remained rooted to his spot. He felt as if he had been turned inside out, as if everything he thought he knew about himself and the world had been revealed as mere preparation for this moment of recognition. Lois's hand was still on his shoulder, but now he felt her tears falling onto his neck. When he turned to look at her, he saw joy and sorrow mingled in her ancient eyes, the expression of someone who had lived long enough to witness prayers answered in ways she had never dared imagine. "Grandmother," Timothy whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "who is this man?" Lois smiled through her tears, her face radiant with the glow of vindicated faith. "He is the one we have been waiting for, child. Not the Messiah himself, but his messenger. The voice that was promised to cry in the wilderness, preparing hearts for the kingdom of heaven." Timothy looked back toward Paul, who was now speaking quietly with small groups of people who had lingered after the main crowd dispersed. The apostle's face was drawn with exhaustion, but his eyes still burned with the fire Timothy had seen from the beginning. Something was being born in Timothy's chest, a certainty that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. His life of careful neutrality was over. His time of safe questions and comfortable doubts had ended. The God his grandmother had described in whispered stories was no longer a figure from ancient history, but a living presence demanding response. The encounter would spend the rest of his life had lasted only hours. but Timothy knew he unpacking its implications. The young man who had awakened that morning as a seeker was falling asleep as one who had been found. The boy caught between worlds had discovered that God's kingdom was large enough to encompass every culture, every question, every heart that dared to reach toward truth. Tomorrow would bring consequences he couldn't imagine. But tonight, for the first time in his life, Timothy knew exactly who he was and whom he served. The stone struck Paul's temple with a sickening sound that cut through the morning air like a blade through silk. Timothy watched in horror as the apostle crumpled to the dust, blood streaming from the wound as voices around the marketplace rose in a crescendo of rage and righteousness. "Blasphemer!" someone shouted. "Deceiver of the people!" The crowd that had worshipped Paul as a god just days before now dragged his limp body toward the city gates with the same fervor they had shown in bringing flowers for sacrifice. Timothy pushed through the press of bodies, his heart hammering against his ribs as he tried to reach the man who had spoken words that changed everything. "He's dead," muttered a voice beside him. "Just as well. These Jewish troublemakers bring nothing but division." But when Timothy finally reached Paul's side outside Lystra's walls, kneeling in the dust beside what should have been a corpse, he felt the faint whisper of breath against his palm. The apostle's chest rose and fell with the barely perceptible rhythm of a man hovering between worlds. Barnabas arrived with other believers, their faces etched with grief and determination. Together they lifted Paul's battered form, carrying him to a house where they could tend his wounds away from hostile eyes. Timothy followed without invitation, driven by something stronger than curiosity or concern. He felt as if his own soul was bleeding from the same stones that had struck the messenger. For 3 days, Paul drifted in and out of consciousness. Timothy rarely left his bedside, bringing water when the apostle could drink, changing blood-soaked cloths, and simply sitting in silence when there was nothing else to do. During those long hours of vigil, he found himself praying with an intensity he had never known, begging the God who had seemed so present during Paul's preaching not to take away the voice that had awakened his heart. On the 3rd evening, Paul's eyes opened with sudden clarity. He looked around the small room, taking inventory of his situation with the practiced assessment of a man accustomed to persecution. When his gaze fell on Timothy, sitting in the corner with a bowl of water and clean cloths, something shifted in his expression. "You," Paul said, his voice rough but carrying unmistakable authority. "Come here." Timothy approached hesitantly, unsure what role he had earned in this drama beyond that of witness. Paul studied his face with the same penetrating attention he had shown when first arriving in Lystra. But now there was recognition in his eyes, as if he were seeing something that had been hidden before. "Tell me about yourself," Paul said simply. So Timothy began to speak. Haltingly at first, then with growing confidence, he shared the story of his mixed heritage, his grandmother's faith, his questions and doubts, his experience of hearing Paul's message. He spoke of the moment when the lame man leaped, of the terror and wonder that had filled his heart, of the certainty that had settled into his bones despite everything his mind insisted was impossible. Paul listened without interruption. his eyes never leaving Timothy's face. When the young man finished his account, silence filled the room like water filling a vessel. Then Paul spoke words that would echo through centuries of Christian history. "Timothy," he said, using the young man's name for the first time, "God has marked you for something beyond ordinary life. I can see it in your eyes, hear it in your voice. You have the heart of one called to carry the message to the ends of the earth." Timothy felt his breath catch. "But I'm nobody," he protested. "I'm young, I'm untested. I've never even traveled beyond Iconium. What could I possibly offer to God's work?" Paul's smile was gentle but tinged with something that might have been sadness. "Do you think God chooses people for their qualifications, Timothy? Look around you. Look at me. I was a persecutor of the church, a man who dragged believers from their homes and watched them die for their faith. If God can use me, he can use anyone." Over the following days, as Paul recovered his strength, Timothy found himself drawn into conversation that stretched his mind and challenged his assumptions. Paul spoke of his own calling on the road to Damascus, of the years of preparation in Arabia, of the gradual revelation of his mission to carry the gospel to the Gentile world. "The work is dangerous," Paul said matter-of-factly as they walked together outside the city. "You've seen what happened to me here, and this was mild compared to what awaits in other places. There will be beatings, imprisonments, shipwrecks, hunger, cold, and rejection by people you're trying to help. Are you prepared for that?" Timothy considered the question seriously. He thought of his comfortable life in Lystra, his family's expectations, the normal path of marriage and business that stretched before him like a well-traveled road. Against that security, Paul was offering uncertainty, suffering, and quite possibly an early death. But he also remembered the moment when the lame man leaped. He recalled the electricity that had passed through the crowd when Paul spoke of the living God. He thought of the hunger in his own heart that nothing in Lystra had ever satisfied. The sense that he was meant for something more significant than the comfortable routines of provincial life. "I'm not prepared," Timothy said honestly. "But I'm willing to learn." Paul stopped walking and turned to face him fully. In the apostle's eyes, Timothy saw approval mixed with something that might have been relief. "That's the only qualification that matters," Paul said. "Willingness to learn, to grow, to be shaped by God's purposes rather than your own." When Paul and Barnabas announced their intention to leave Lystra, Timothy made the decision that would define the rest of his life. Despite his mother's tears, despite his grandmother's concerns about his youth and inexperience, despite his own terror at leaving everything familiar, he asked to join their mission. The night before their departure, Timothy sat with Lois in their family courtyard, watching stars wheel overhead in patterns that had guided travelers since the beginning of time. His grandmother held his hands in hers, her weathered fingers tracing the lines of his palms as if reading a map of his future. "I always knew this day would come," she said quietly. "From the time you were small, I could see that God had marked you for something special. I just hoped I would be alive to see it begin." "I'm frightened," Timothy admitted. "What if I'm not strong enough? What if I fail?" Lois smiled, her eyes reflecting starlight and accumulated wisdom. Fear is not the enemy of faith, child. Doubt is not the opposite of trust. God doesn't call the equipped, He equips the called. Your mixed heritage, your questions, your sensitivity to other people's pain, all of it has been preparation for this moment. She reached into the folds of her robe and withdrew a small scroll, its parchment yellowed with age. These are the words I taught you as a child, the promises I whispered over you when you slept. Take them with you. When the road grows dark, when the mission seems impossible, when you wonder if God has forgotten you, remember that His word never fails. Timothy took the scroll with trembling hands, feeling the weight of generations of faith compressed into its ancient text. This was his inheritance, more precious than gold or land or position. This was the foundation upon which his new life would be built. As dawn broke over Lystra, painting the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold, Timothy shouldered his simple pack and joined Paul and Barnabas at the city gates. A small crowd had gathered to see them off, some believers who had been transformed by Paul's message, others merely curious about the young man who was leaving everything familiar to follow strangers into an uncertain future. His mother was there, her eyes red with weeping but her face set with determination. She pressed a small bag of coins into his hands, her life savings converted into traveling money for her son's impossible mission. "Come back to us when you can," she whispered. "But don't come back unchanged." Lois stood beside her daughter, leaning heavily on a walking stick but radiant with joy. She raised her hand in blessing as Timothy passed through the gates, her voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "The Lord bless you and keep you, my child. May His face shine upon you wherever the road may lead." Timothy turned for one last look at the city of his birth, at the familiar streets and faces that had shaped his first 18 years. Then he faced forward, toward horizons he had never seen, toward challenges he couldn't imagine, toward a calling that would transform him from a questioning boy into one of history's most trusted servants of the gospel. The road stretched ahead like an invitation written in dust and stone. Behind him lay security, comfort, and the predictable rhythms of ordinary life. Before him waited adventure, danger, and the extraordinary privilege of participating in God's purposes for human history. Timothy took his first step into the unknown, his heart hammering with fear and excitement in equal measure. He was no longer a boy caught between worlds. He was a young man walking purposefully toward the destiny that had been calling his name since before his birth. The impossible mission had begun. The road to Iconium stretched before them like a ribbon of possibility and peril, winding through landscapes that seemed to shift between promise and threat with each turn. Timothy walked between Paul and Barnabas, his sandals raising small clouds of dust that caught the morning light like prayers ascending. 3 days had passed since leaving Lystra, and already the comfortable certainties of his former life felt like memories from another man's story. The weight of his decision pressed against his shoulders more heavily than his simple traveling pack. With each mile that separated him from home, Timothy felt the magnitude of what he had chosen. He was no longer the young man who asked careful questions and avoided taking positions that might offend. He had aligned himself with something that demanded everything and promised nothing except the privilege of participation in a mystery larger than individual comfort. Paul walked with the measured pace of a man who had learned to conserve energy for battles that mattered. His wounds from the stoning were healing, but Timothy could see how the apostle favored his left side, how he sometimes paused to catch his breath when he thought no one was looking. Yet there was something unbreakable in Paul's bearing, a core of certainty that seemed to grow stronger rather than weaker under pressure. "Tell me about doubt," Timothy said as they paused at a stream to refill their water skins. Paul looked up from where he knelt beside the flowing water, his eyes reflecting depths that Timothy was only beginning to fathom. "What kind of doubt?" "The kind that comes in the middle of the night," Timothy replied, surprised by his own honesty. "When you lie awake wondering if you've made a terrible mistake. When everything you thought was clear suddenly seems foggy again." Barnabas, who had been quietly observing their exchange, smiled with the gentle wisdom of a man who had wrestled with similar questions. "Ah," he said, "you mean the doubt that proves your faith is real." Timothy frowned, not understanding the apparent contradiction. Paul straightened, water dripping from his cupped hands as he studied Timothy's face. "False certainty never questions itself," he explained. "Only living faith is humble enough to examine its own foundations. The doubt you're experiencing isn't weakness, Timothy. It's your spirit ensuring that what you've committed to is worthy of commitment." They resumed walking as the sun climbed higher, painting the rocky landscape in shades of gold and amber. Timothy found himself thinking about the believers they had left behind in Lystra, ordinary people who had heard Paul's message and felt their worlds shift on their foundations. How many of them were experiencing similar midnight wrestlings with questions that had no easy answers? "Will they be safe?" Timothy asked, voicing a concern that had been growing since their departure. Paul's expression darkened slightly. "Safety was never promised to those who follow this path, but protection is a different matter entirely. God doesn't shield his people from difficulty, but he sustains them through it." As if summoned by Paul's words, a group of travelers appeared on the road ahead, moving toward them with the purposeful stride of men on official business. Timothy felt his stomach tighten as he recognized the bearing of those accustomed to authority and the expectation of immediate compliance. The leader of the group, a man whose Roman citizenship was proclaimed by every detail of his dress and deportment, raised his hand in the universal gesture of halt. His companions, a mixture of local officials and hired muscle, arranged themselves with the practiced efficiency of those who had performed this routine many times before. "You are the Jewish teacher called Paul?" The question carried the weight of predetermined judgment. "I am Paul of Tarsus," the apostle replied, his voice steady but carefully neutral. The Roman's eyes narrowed as he studied the three travelers. "We have received reports of your activities in Lystra. Disturbances, unauthorized religious gatherings, claims of miraculous healings that have unsettled the local population." Timothy felt heat rise in his chest, indignation at the casual dismissal of what he had witnessed with his own eyes. But Paul's hand brushed his arm in warning, a subtle reminder that wisdom sometimes requires silence even in the face of injustice. We shared a message of hope with those who chose to listen, Paul said carefully. No laws were broken. No violence was incited by our actions, yet violence occurred, the official replied, his tone suggesting that the distinction Paul was making carried no weight in his analysis. A man was nearly killed. Order was disrupted. Commerce was affected. Barnabas stepped slightly forward, his diplomatic instincts engaging. Surely the representatives of Rome understand the difference between causing disorder and being the victim of it. We were the ones attacked, not the attackers. The Romans studied Barnabas with the calculating gaze of a man accustomed to evaluating threats and advantages. Perhaps. But your presence seems to catalyze complications. Complications that require administrative attention and resources. Such complications are generally discouraged. Timothy watched this verbal fencing match with growing frustration. These men were discussing Paul's near-death experience as if it were merely an inconvenience to their paperwork. The miracle he had witnessed, the transformation of hearts he had seen, all of it reduced to administrative complications requiring management. We seek no conflict with Rome, Paul said, his voice carrying undertones that Timothy was learning to recognize. The apostle was choosing his battles, conserving his energy for fights that mattered while navigating the immediate danger with diplomatic skill. See that you continue to seek no conflict, the official replied. But understand that your reputation precedes you now. Other communities have been informed about your activities. You may find your audiences less receptive than you expect. With that thinly veiled threat delivered, the Roman and his companions continued on their journey, leaving the three missionaries standing in the dust of their passage. Timothy waited until they were well out of earshot before giving voice to his outrage. How can they be so blind? He demanded. They saw a lame man walking, healed by God's power, and they call it an administrative complication? Paul's smile was sad but understanding. They see what they're prepared to see, Timothy. Their world is built on the assumption that all reality can be managed, categorized, and controlled by human institutions. Miracles threaten that assumption, so they must be explained away or discouraged. But doesn't that make you angry? Timothy pressed. Anger is a luxury I can't afford, Paul replied. These men aren't evil, just limited by the frameworks they've inherited. My anger won't expand their vision or soften their hearts. Only love can do that, and love requires patience. As they resumed their journey, Timothy found himself wrestling with new questions about the nature of the mission he had joined. He had expected opposition from obviously hostile forces, but this casual dismissal by representatives of civilization itself felt more threatening somehow. It suggested that the message they carried would always be seen as disruption by those who benefited from maintaining existing systems. The afternoon brought them to a crossroads where other travelers had paused to rest in the shade of ancient olive trees. Timothy listened as Paul engaged these strangers in conversation, gradually steering their discussion toward deeper questions about meaning, purpose, and the nature of divine relationship with humanity. Some responded with genuine interest, asking questions that revealed spiritual hunger beneath their practical concerns about trade routes and family obligations. Others listened politely but remained focused on more immediate matters. A few showed signs of the same institutional resistance they had encountered earlier, treating Paul's words as potentially destabilizing influences on social order. Timothy observed it all with growing understanding. The mission Paul had called him to wasn't simply about preaching to willing audiences or performing miracles for amazed crowds. It was about persisting in the face of indifference, maintaining hope despite rejection, and continuing to offer love to people who often preferred the familiar pain of their current situation to the uncertain promise of transformation. That evening, as they made camp beside a small spring, Timothy found himself staring into their fire and thinking about the believers in Lystra. Were they gathering secretly now, sharing the stories Paul had told them? Were they supporting each other through the inevitable questions and doubts that followed such radical reorientation of understanding? "They'll be all right," Paul said quietly, as if reading Timothy's thoughts. Timothy looked up to find the apostle watching him with paternal concern. "How can you be sure?" "Because the same God who called them to faith will sustain them in it," Paul replied. "Our job isn't to protect people from the consequences of believing, Timothy. Our job is to plant seeds and trust the divine gardener to bring the harvest in his time." Barnabas, who had been quietly mending a tear in his cloak, looked up from his work. "The resistance we face isn't really about us," he added. "It's about what we represent. Change, challenge to comfortable assumptions, the possibility that life might be more demanding but also more meaningful than people have dared to hope." Timothy nodded slowly, beginning to understand that the opposition they encountered was as much a sign of their message's power as the positive responses they received. People didn't resist ideas that carried no weight or challenge assumptions that posed no threat to their established patterns of living. As the fire burned lower and his companion settled into sleep, Timothy remained awake longer, watching stars appear in the darkening sky. Somewhere behind them, Lystra continued its ancient rhythms, but with a difference now. Seeds had been planted in hearts that would never be quite the same. The kingdom of God had taken root in soil that had seemed unpromising, and no amount of official disapproval or social resistance could prevent its growth. Tomorrow would bring Iconium, with new challenges and new opportunities. But tonight, Timothy felt something settling into place within him. A deeper understanding of what it meant to serve a cause larger than personal comfort or social approval. The age of resistance had begun, but so had the age of persistence. The boy who had left Lystra seeking adventure was becoming a man who understood that some battles are won not through force, but through the patient determination to keep planting seeds, even in rocky ground. The prison cell in Philippi reeked of human misery and institutional neglect. Timothy pressed his back against the cold stone wall, listening to Paul and Silas sing hymns in the darkness while their fellow prisoners muttered prayers or curses in languages he couldn't identify. The iron shackles around his wrists had worn raw spots on his skin, and his stomach cramped from days of eating nothing but stale bread and brackish water. This wasn't how he had imagined serving God's purposes. When the earthquake came at midnight, rattling the foundations of the prison until doors flew open and chains fell loose, Timothy's first thought wasn't of escape, but of wonder. even here, in this place that seemed forsaken by hope, the divine presence could manifest with earth-shaking power. Yet it was Paul's response that truly amazed him. Instead of fleeing, the apostle called out to prevent the jailer's suicide, turning a moment of potential freedom into an opportunity for transformation. The jailer's trembling voice had asked the question that echoes through every human heart. What must I do to be saved? And in Paul's gentle answer, Timothy heard the fulfillment of every promise whispered in his grandmother's prayers. Not through rituals or genealogies or perfect understanding, but through simple trust in the one who had been seeking them all along. Years had woven silver through Timothy's hair now, and the roads of his youth had carved lines of wisdom around his eyes. He stood at the harbor in Ephesus, watching ships arrive from distant ports, their sails pregnant with wind and possibility. The city hummed with commerce and conversation in a dozen languages, but Timothy's attention was drawn to something that couldn't be weighed in markets or negotiated in councils. The church had grown beyond anything he could have imagined that morning in Lystra, when a lame man leaped for joy. What had begun as scattered seeds carried by traveling missionaries had taken root in soil across the Mediterranean world. In Corinth, believers gathered in homes that had once hosted pagan banquets. In Rome, slaves and senators shared the same cup of communion. In Jerusalem, Jewish followers of Jesus debated with Gentile converts about the shape of God's expanding kingdom. Timothy carried letters from Paul now, words that burned with the same fire that had transformed his own heart decades earlier. But these weren't merely correspondence between friends. They were documents that future generations would treasure as scripture. Guidance for churches that hadn't yet been planted, answers to questions that hadn't yet been asked. My true son in the faith, Paul had written, and Timothy finally understood the weight of that designation. It wasn't biological inheritance or even personal affection, though both were present. It was something far more significant. The passing of a torch that would light pathways through centuries yet to come. In quiet moments between the demands of leadership, Timothy would unfold the ancient scroll his grandmother had given him, its parchment now brittle with age. The promises Lois had whispered over his childhood sleep were finding fulfillment in ways none of them could have predicted. The boy caught between worlds had become a bridge builder, helping Jewish believers and Gentile converts discover their shared identity in Christ. But revelation came with a price that Timothy was only beginning to calculate. The message that had set him free from the prison of cultural confusion was now his greatest burden. Churches looked to him for guidance when Paul was imprisoned or traveling. Believers brought him their doubts, their failures, their desperate questions about how to live faithfully in a hostile world. Sometimes in the pre-dawn darkness of his small quarters, Timothy felt the weight of inadequacy pressing against his chest like a physical presence. Who was he to shepherd souls, to make decisions that affected entire communities, to speak with authority about mysteries that still left him breathless with wonder? Yet it was in these moments of acknowledged weakness that Timothy experienced the deepest revelations. The same God who had heard his cry as a questioning youth continued to speak, not in audible voices or dramatic visions, but in the quiet certainty that settled into his heart during prayer. The divine presence that had seemed so elusive during his adolescent searching now felt as constant as his own heartbeat. The letter from Rome arrived on a morning when Mediterranean storms had cleared the harbor of all but the most essential traffic. Timothy recognized Paul's handwriting immediately, though the script was shakier than usual, betrayed by age and difficult circumstances. His hands trembled slightly as he broke the seal, knowing that this correspondence might be among their last exchanges. "The time of my departure has come," Paul had written. "I have fought the good fight. I have finished the course. I have kept the faith." Timothy pressed the letter to his chest, feeling tears gather at the corners of his eyes. The man who had called him from comfortable obscurity to dangerous significance was preparing for his final journey. But even in farewell, Paul's words carried the same transformative power that had changed Timothy's life in Lystra's marketplace decades earlier. "But you, man of God, pursue righteousness, godliness, faith, love, steadfastness, gentleness. Fight the good fight of faith. Take hold of the eternal life to which you were called." The revelation that washed over Timothy in that moment wasn't new information but deeper understanding. Paul's legacy wasn't primarily in the churches he had planted or the letters he had written, though both would endure. His true legacy was in the